He didn't shout, he didn't slam a door. He just looked down at the floor while tightening his tie, said it plain and clear, like a fact, like the sky being blue, and then left me in the hallway, holding a casserole dish I'd brought for his family, still warm, still wrapped in the towel I'd embroidered the year his daughter was born. I'm Mary Carson, I'm 71 years old. And that was the moment I knew I no longer lived in their world. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I stood in their entryway a little too long, pretending to check my shoes for mud. They'd just refinished the floors. I noticed that used to be the kind of thing he'd call and tell me about. Mom, we're going with oak this time. Not laminate, real wood. But I hadn't heard about the floors or the new dishwasher or the patio they'd redone for summer. I learned by standing on it. That day, I'd driven 47 minutes from my small condo, the one I downsized into after selling my husband's shop, to bring over their favorite beef and barley casserole, just like I used to make when they were little. His wife had sent out one of those casual group texts about everyone bringing something for dinner. I don't think she meant me, but I came anyway. I had the day off. I had the memory of being needed. I rang the bell even though I still had a key. They changed the locks 3 years ago and said something vague about a smart system. I never asked. When my granddaughter opened the door, she blinked like she wasn't sure who I was. Daddy's still getting ready, she said, and padded back to the living room without a hug. I stepped inside. The house smelled like vanilla wax melts and detergent to clean. Like no one had cried here in a long time, like nothing had been broken and patched back together by hand. I looked down and saw my own reflection in their hallway mirror. My lipstick was too pink. The scarf was too bright. I tried too hard. I always did. He came down the stairs, buttoning his collar, and smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. Oh, hey, he said, nodding toward the kitchen. We weren't expecting you to bring something. We're good. I held out the casserole like a peace offering. I thought that's when he cut me off. Calm, clean, not cruel, just certain. Mom, you don't have to do all this. We're adults now. We don't owe you anything. It didn't come with a storm. Just stillness, the kind that leaves a silence so thick you don't know where to stand inside it. He didn't mean it like a knife. He meant it like a ceiling beam, part of the structure. But it still splintered something in me. I didn't argue. I placed the casserole on the counter, next to a store-bought pie still in its plastic shell. My dish looked old-fashioned beside it, glass, heavy, homemade, like me. The rest of the evening passed in little fragments. His wife offered me tea but didn't ask me to sit. The grandkids were glued to screens. No one asked how I was sleeping these days, or if the sciatica was better, or if I'd gotten the call from Dr. Levitt about the blood work. I stood for most of it, just stood, near the window, near the back door, near their life. By the time dessert was served, I'd already decided I would not come again uninvited, and I would not ask to be invited. I left the key on their kitchen counter, under a sticky note that said, "Thanks for having me." I didn't know what else to write. It was better than saying nothing, and less than saying too much. Outside, the air was crisp. Autumn had started to turn the trees, and the breeze smelled like pine needles and chimney smoke. It reminded me of all the Octobers I'd spent baking pumpkin bread and driving to soccer games, all the little costumes I sewed by hand, the tiny capes, the glitter wings, the foam swords. Now I was just a woman walking to a car that nobody waved goodbye to. The drive home was quiet, no radio, just the sound of wind through the cracked window and the occasional sigh of the engine when I slowed at a yellow light. I passed our old house on the way back, not on purpose. It was just a habit I hadn't yet broken. Someone else lives there now. They painted the shutters and removed the tire swing. The maple tree out front still stands, though still tall. Still mine in some strange, unspoken way. Back at my condo, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I let the darkness wrap around me, sat in the armchair near the window. Looked out at nothing in particular. I kept thinking of his words, like they'd been etched into stone and handed to me. We don't owe you anything. Maybe he was right. Maybe children don't owe their parents anything. But love, real love, was never a debt. It was something given freely, over time, through little things. Through casseroles and carpools and the way you sit in a cold auditorium for 2 hours just to clap at the end of a school play. And I had given. For decades, I had given everything. And in that moment, with a scarf to bright and a casserole still warm, I realized I had given it to someone who no longer saw me. Not as a mother, not as a person. Not even as a guest worth seating at the table. And from that moment forward, I would begin the slow, quiet work of taking myself back. I used to think love was built in layers, like the quilt my grandmother made me the year I turned 16, the one with the faded reds and soft blue panels stitched from old dresses and curtains. Each square told a story, each corner was a memory, a quiet act of care folded in with time. I kept that quilt for years, mended it more than once, and now, when I look back at the years I gave to my family, that's what I see. 1,000 little stitches holding together something they don't even realize is wrapped around them. I met my husband, Henry, in the summer of 1972. He had hands that looked like they could lift a truck. But he read poetry and wrote with a fountain pen. We married the following spring. We bought a 2-bedroom house with a detached garage and one of those stoves that clicked when you turned the gas on. It wasn't much. But we painted the walls ourselves and planted hydrangeas near the fence. When our son came, our only child, I remember holding him against my chest and promising him out loud, "You'll never go without." I whispered it while rocking him through the colic, while pacing the floor in socks because the hardwood was too loud under his crib. That promise became the rhythm of my life. I worked nights at the diner, always kept extra cash tucked inside. A coffee tin behind the sugar canisters. Henry ran his auto repair shop, the kind of place where folks trusted you enough to say, "Fix it when you can, and I'll pay you Friday." We lived modestly. But there was always enough for school shoes, for birthday cakes, for last-minute field trip money. I remember every detail of his 3rd grade volcano project, how I helped mold the clay, how he insisted on red glitter for lava, how it exploded in the kitchen sink because I bought the wrong kind of vinegar. I remember bandaging skinned knees, letting him cry into my sweater the year he didn't make the basketball team, staying up past midnight helping him memorize lines for the school play. I remember saving for months to buy him his first suit for prom, charcoal grey, slim fit, even though he didn't want to go at first. I made him breakfast nearly every day until he left for college. Even then, I mailed him care packages, peanut brittle, his favourite pens, socks with little cartoons on them. I left the notes unsigned because I didn't want to embarrass him in front of his roommates. I just wanted him to feel, in some quiet way, that home was still looking out for him. When Henry got sick, our son came home for exactly 3 days. He was finishing his degree and said he couldn't miss too much class. I didn't argue. I told myself he was doing something important. Building a future, I watched my husband's body weaken slowly, day by day, as I gave him his meds, changed his sheets, held his hand when he forgot what month it was. Henry passed away on a Thursday morning too, years before the one that would leave me standing in that hallway with a casserole dish. After the funeral, I packed up the garage, boxed his tools, and cleaned out the shed. I gave our son the leather-bound service manuals his father loved. He never came to pick them up. Still, I visited their house every Sunday without fail. I'd bring groceries, offer to watch the kids, fold laundry if I saw it waiting. Sometimes they were happy to see me. Sometimes they seemed neutral. I tried not to take it personally. People get busy. They grow into lives that leave less room for the ones who made them. But still, I remembered the birthdays. I sewed Halloween costumes. I sat in the bleachers with cold coffee in hand, watching soccer matches in the rain. I stayed overnight when my daughter-in-law had surgery, sleeping on their couch so the kids wouldn't miss school. I paid for braces, for piano lessons, for a dog they couldn't afford but said the kids had fallen in love with. I told them it was just a gift, but that money came from what Henry left behind. There was a Christmas Eve, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when the power went out from a snowstorm. I drove across town with thermoses of hot soup and extra blankets. Their house was dark when I pulled up, but the windows were glowing from candlelight. I stood outside for a moment, watching the shadows move across the walls, watching my grandchildren laugh through the glass. I knocked, but no one came. The music inside was too loud. I left the soup on the doorstep and drove home in silence. It wasn't always like this. There were good years. I've held onto those. The days when my son would call just to check in, when he'd bring over flowers just because. He used to kiss my cheek when he left. He used to tell people proudly, "That's my mom." I don't know exactly when that stopped. I never asked for much. Not really. I never demanded holidays, never insisted on thank you cards or phone calls. I just wanted to be remembered, not for what I gave, but for who I was. For the warmth I tried to carry, the way I held everything together, even when it felt like it was falling apart. It's a strange thing to feel invisible in a room full of people whose lives you built, to realize that your love has become background noise, like a faucet dripping somewhere in a house. Present. Persistent but unnoticed, I still kept showing up, though that's what mothers do. We show up, even when no one claps when we walk in, even when no one thinks to ask if we're cold or tired. Or if we cried last night thinking about a photograph we hadn't seen in years. I thought that maybe, if I just loved enough, quietly, faithfully, I would stay stitched into their lives like the quilt my grandmother made. Soft, steady, indispensable. But love given in silence is easy to forget, and they had started forgetting me. It didn't happen all at once. That's what makes it hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. If they'd slammed a door, cursed me out, or written a letter telling me to stay away, maybe I could have pointed to that moment and said, "Here, this is where it changed." But it wasn't loud like that. It was gradual, a soft unraveling, one thread at a time, like the way I stopped getting birthday calls, not just late ones, I mean none at all. The first time it happened, I told myself they were busy. My son had work. The kids had school. I kept the phone by my side the entire day anyway. Every time it lit up, my heart fluttered like a moth drawn to something warm. But it was just a reminder from the pharmacy. A neighbor sent a blurry photo of her cat. The window repairman confirmed an appointment. That evening, I lit a candle and sang to myself, quietly. Half-hearted, I didn't even slice the cake I'd bought. Then came Christmas when they kept it small. That was the phrase in the text. "We're just keeping it small this year." No invitation, just a notification. I sent gifts anyway. Wrapped each one by hand, wrote cards with little poems. The kind I used to tuck into lunchboxes when my son was in grade school. I dropped the box at their doorstep, stood back, and waited a few minutes in the car. I thought maybe someone would open the door, but they didn't. There was no thank you, not in a call, not in a text. The next time I visited, I saw 2 of the presents still unopened under their TV stand. Dust had gathered on one of them. Another thread snapped the day my granddaughter got her first solo in choir. I'd been the one driving her to lessons every Other week, while her mother juggled appointments, I'd even helped her practice, sitting cross-legged on the carpet while she nervously sang to the mirror. I knew the words by heart, but the night of the performance, I wasn't told. I found out 2 weeks later, by accident, when a neighbor mentioned seeing the photos on social media. She looked so grown up, she said, smiling. I nodded and smiled back, but my chest had gone hollow. I searched for the pictures later, found them easily. My granddaughter in a navy dress, lips parted mid-song, a spotlight washing her face in gold. My son stood in the background of one photo, arms folded, grinning like he'd never known a worry. I wasn't tagged, I wasn't there. It wasn't just the events, it was the little refusals, the times they turned down my offers to babysit, the weeks without a single text. The new rules about calling first before dropping by, even when I was just returning a jacket someone left in my car. They stopped telling me when the kids were sick, when they got awards, when they travelled. I found things out through neighbours, through glimpses online, through the silences that followed questions I asked and they politely dodged. It became easier for them to talk around me than to talk to me. There were signs. I guess, hints that I didn't belong the way I used to. They started using words like space and boundaries, not in anger, but with that clipped politeness that sounds like a locked door with a peephole. They said things like, "We've got it handled." When I offered help, no need to fuss. When I brought over food, "The kids are too old for that now." When I asked if they still needed rides, eventually, they stopped correcting me at all. Just let my suggestions fall flat, like pennies into a fountain that no one had wished on in years. One afternoon, I showed up with a box of family photos I thought they might want. Some had my son's crayon scribbles on the back, little notes he wrote as a boy, me and Daddy fishing. Mom's cake, first snow. I thought maybe the kids would want to see them. But when I handed them over, my daughter-in-law said, "Oh, just leave them in the garage. We'll go through them later." The box sat there for months. I know because I saw it each time I pulled into their driveway. It never moved. Even my cooking, once a source of comfort, became unneeded. They switched to meal kits, gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free. I didn't know how to make those things. I tried once. Spent hours adjusting an old recipe. When I brought it over, they thanked me, but no one touched it. "You really don't need to go through the trouble anymore," my son said once. He smiled when he said it, like he was being kind, but the words had weight. What I came to understand, slowly, painfully, is that I had become an obligation, a checkbox. A figure in the background of their lives who lingered to long at the edges of photos, and when you become that, people stop looking you in the eye, they talk over you at dinner, they forget you're in the room. They don't notice when you take out the trash, or when you fold a blanket no one asked you to. They don't ask how you're doing. Not really. They assume they know. They assume you're fine because you always have been. But I wasn't fine. I had begun to disappear. In my own story, I no longer brought up the holidays. I stopped suggesting outings. I deleted the old group chat we used to use for Sunday plans. I kept everything light. No worries, of course, I understand. Maybe next time. I once sat in their living room for 2 hours while the kids played upstairs, and my son typed on his laptop, barely saying more than 5 words to me. I watched the clock on the wall. I counted how many times he sipped his coffee. 13. I left without a goodbye. He didn't notice. That's the kind of hurt no one sees. The kind that doesn't bruise or bleed, but sinks into your bones and stays there. The kind that grows quietly, like mold behind a wall, invisible until it's everywhere. I told myself it was just a season, that family ebb and flow. Maybe I'd done something wrong and just hadn't realized. I asked myself that more than once. Did I do something? Did I love too hard, hold on too long? But there was no answer. Just a silence that got longer and heavier with each passing year, a silence that would eventually lead to something irreversible. Though I didn't know it yet, the final thread was already fraying. It was just a house, that's what they said. When the final decision was made, when the papers were signed, and the memories boxed up, that's what they kept repeating. Just a house, like saying it that way would make it smaller. Like it would erase the decades folded into every floorboard, every photograph, every inch of wall once marked with a child's height in pencil. But it wasn't just a house. It was the last thing I still had that felt like ours, after Henry passed and the world quieted down. I held onto that house like it was a tether, not because it was grand, it wasn't, but because it was filled with echoes that still spoke to me. The sound of his boots near the back door, the scratch of his pen against Bill's at the kitchen table, the way his cough used to bounce off the bathroom tiles in winter. Even after he was gone, I still set his slippers out beside the radiator. The backyard was where we planted tomatoes every June, and where my son once fell asleep in a sleeping bag during a meteor shower, wrapped up like a caterpillar, cheeks smudged with dirt. The bedroom windows had curtains I sewed myself from fabric Henry picked up on a whim during a road trip to Lancaster. He said it reminded him of picnic blankets, and I told him that was ridiculous, but I made them anyway, and we laughed. When I downsized and moved into the condo, I kept the house. Not to live in, not anymore, but to hold, to care for. I rented it out to a quiet couple who kept the yard tidy and sent me holiday cards. I drove by sometimes, parked across the street just to see the porch light glowing. That light made me feel like something of us still stood. It was mine, legally, emotionally, soulfully, until they took it. It started with a suggestion. My son said the taxes were eating into my retirement, that I didn't need the burden, that selling would lighten the load. I told him I was fine, that the rent covered everything, that it gave me peace. He smiled at that flat smile he wears when he's already made up his mind. A few weeks later, he brought up the power of attorney paperwork I'd signed years ago, back when Henry was first in hospice. And the world was blurring around the edges. Just in case, he'd said back then, so I can help with the accounts if you're too overwhelmed. I barely remembered the details. I trusted him, of course I did. He was my son. But power of attorney means something, especially in the wrong hands. Especially when no one bothers to ask what you want anymore. One day, I got a letter from a real estate company addressed to me, confirming an appointment I hadn't scheduled. A walkthrough of my old home. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a mix-up. I called the number and the receptionist said, "Oh yes, we spoke with your son. He's handling the closing. I hung up. My hands were shaking. I called him. He didn't answer. I texted him, "What's going on with the house?" Nothing, not for ours. When he finally called, his voice was calm, rehearsed. "Mum, we went ahead and finalized the sale. The market's high right now, and I didn't want you to miss the window. You'll thank me later." I will never forget the silence between that sentence and my reply. I think he expected gratitude, or maybe he expected tears, but I gave him nothing, just breathing. Just the sound of a woman trying not to unravel on the phone with the person she once rocked to sleep. "You had no right," I said quietly. "You signed the papers. It's legal, Mom." He said it like a fact, like gravity, like rain falling. Legal, not kind, not just, not fair, but legal. I didn't fight. I didn't scream or beg. I ended the call, sat in the dark for an hour, then opened the drawer in my bedroom where I still kept Henry's pocket knife, his watch, and the deed to the house. I looked at the signature, my name next to his, and I cried, not for the house, but for the erasure. That house was where I became a wife, where I learned to be a mother, where I fell asleep with a baby pressed to my chest and woke up with a backache but a full heart. That house knew me, helped me, gave me more comfort than any person had in years, and now it belonged to someone else, sold in silence, cashed out like a chip on a table I was no longer allowed to sit at. The worst part wasn't the sale itself, it was that he didn't tell me, that he thought he had the right, that my voice no longer mattered in decisions about my own life. That was the moment the air changed between us. When you love someone enough, you give them pieces of yourself. I had handed him everything across the years: time, tenderness, trust. But love given blindly becomes a lever in the hands of someone who no longer sees you. He used my trust to take something sacred, and I let him. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the last picture of the house in front of me. The porch light was still on in the photo. The curtains still hung in the window. I wondered if the new owners would keep them. Probably not. They'd tear them down, repaint the walls and dig up the garden, erase the story. That was the line. Not the missed birthdays, not the quiet exclusions, not the forgotten holidays or unopened gifts. It was the moment I became a transaction. The moment my history was filed under assets and my voice under non-essential. I poured a glass of water, sat in the stillness, and told myself something I hadn't dared admit out loud until then. If they could take that from me, they would take anything, and I needed to start protecting what was left. The next morning, I woke up and didn't speak to anyone, not out of anger, not even out of pain. I was simply empty, like a well that had been drawn from too many times, like a room where the furniture's been taken and the curtains are closed. There was no sound inside me anymore, just air, just space, a strange, unfamiliar stillness that I didn't rush to fill. Silence, it turns out, can be a kind of grace. I made coffee, fed the birds outside my window, washed the same plate twice. But I didn't call anyone, I didn't text, I didn't check social media or scroll through old photos hoping to feel something again. I just moved gently through the quiet. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to not be needed. There was something almost holy in it. I started small. I stopped initiating contact. If they reached out, I answered politely. If they didn't, I let the silence hang. I no longer offered rides or asked if anyone needed dinner. I didn't remind anyone of dentist appointments or send cards in the mail, or drop off homemade soup just in case someone caught a cold. I became a soft ghost in their world, still breathing, still present, but untethered from their daily rhythms. I withdrew slowly, like a tide pulling back from a shore it no longer trusted. At first, they didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't say. Maybe they thought I was sulking. Maybe they thought I was finally learning how to let go, the way they always hinted I should. Either way, they didn't check in, and I didn't correct them. Instead, I turned my energy inward, not in bitterness, but in preservation. I began sorting through boxes in the back of my closet, the ones I hadn't opened in years, old tax files, receipts from Henry's shop, letters from my sister before she passed. I shredded what I didn't need, kept only what mattered, and created space, not just physical space, mental space, emotional space. I met with a new lawyer, a quiet woman named Janine with kind eyes and a voice like still water. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat across from her desk and handed her a folder I'd prepared, filled with account statements, property documents, and my old will. I need to make some changes, I said simply. She nodded and didn't ask questions, just listened, took notes, made copies. She told me I wasn't the first mother who'd sat in that chair asking for privacy. That stayed with me, the quiet acknowledgement that this story wasn't mine alone, that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't weak. I opened a new bank account in my own name, linked to nothing but my own peace of mind, transferred what I could without drawing attention. Closed the shared emergency fund my son once asked me to open, just in case the kids need help with. College, they never called it an emergency when they used it, they just told me after the money had moved. So I closed it. Quietly, I cancelled the birthday subscriptions I had set up for the grandkids, the ones that sent new books or art supplies each month. I didn't send a note explaining why. I simply stopped. I pulled my energy out like a thread from a tapestry, one loop at a time. I also started walking every morning. Just me, the pavement, and the slow rhythm of my breath. I passed the same old houses, nodded to the same dogs, watched the seasons change with an attention I hadn't allowed myself in years. I started noticing things, the way the light hit the maple trees near the elementary school, the smell of fresh mulch in April, the quiet hum of my own thoughts when I stopped trying to be heard. At the grocery store, I stopped checking if anyone needed anything before I went. I bought only what I liked: real butter, imported tea. The kind of bread I used to consider too expensive for myself. I came home with small indulgences. And no guilt. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote a single line at the top. What do I want now? It took me a long time to answer. Not because the list was long, but because I hadn't asked myself that question in years. I used to want what was best for them, for my son, for the grandkids, for the woman who married him and never quite saw me as more than an accessory in their lives. But now I wasn't sure. I wrote down a few things. I wanted to visit the coast again. I wanted to buy new curtains. I wanted to frame the photo of Henry holding our son at the hospital, the one where his eyes are still full of awe. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to prove anything. I didn't want apologies. I just wanted to be free of the weight of constantly being overlooked. That, I realized, was my new form of love. Not the giving kind, but the self-protecting kind, the kind that says, enough, without shouting. The kind that preserves what's left of you after being scraped down to the bone. Some nights I still cried, but even the tears changed. They were quieter, thinner, less angry, like my body was releasing old grief instead of feeding new wounds. I stopped telling people I was fine. I started saying things like, I'm figuring things out, or I'm resting. And in that honesty, I found something better than fine. I found it real. I took out my sewing machine again, dusted it off. Bought fabric with no particular plan, just because I liked the colors. I started stitching a new quilt, not for anyone, not for birthdays or weddings or apologies, just for myself, just because my hand still remembered how. And one morning, while folding it over the edge of my bed, I realized something simple and true. This silence I had stepped into, it wasn't emptiness. It was space, space for breath, for choice, for healing. They hadn't taken everything from me. They had only taken what I gave them, and I had more still, quiet, steady, unseen, but mine. The shift was quiet, like most things in my life had become. There was no announcement, no dramatic goodbye, just a soft pivot, a change in direction that only I could feel. I stopped waiting for things to return to how they were. That was the first movement, a mental unhooking. I'd spent so long trying to get back to something, the way they used to call, the way holidays used to feel, the way my son used to reach for my hand in crowded places. But I'd finally stopped reaching backward, not out of defeat, but because I had turned toward something else, something new, and maybe, for the first time in years, something mine. I woke up early that Monday and opened every window in the condo. The air was cool, sharp with spring. I moved through the rooms with a broom and a trash bag and began tossing anything that no longer served me, anything I was keeping just in case they came by again. That included the stack of colouring books in the hallway cupboard, the booster seat in the corner of the guest room. The carefully labelled bins of toys I'd once rescued from garage sales and cleaned until they looked new, I donated them to the shelter near the train station. It hurts. In the way that pulling out a splinter hurts, sharp but necessary. I gave away 3 dresses I hadn't worn since my son's wedding. One of them still had a tag. I sold Henry's old desk to a retired teacher who said she needed a space that felt honest. That made me smile. I liked the sound of that. A space that felt honest. I started keeping fresh flowers in the kitchen, not store-bought arrangements, but little bunches from the farmer's market, imperfect stems, often mismatched. I liked how they leaned in different directions. I liked how they didn't try to be symmetrical. I stopped worrying about centerpieces. I changed my routines, too. Tuesday mornings, I took myself out for breakfast. Nothing fancy, just a small diner a few blocks away with cracked mugs and paper menus. The waitress always called me sweetheart, and she remembered how I liked my toast. I began journaling again, just a few lines each night. Sometimes just lists, what I saw on my walk, what I ate, what I felt when I stood at the sink and let the warm water run over my hands. It anchored me in the present. I got to know my neighbours. Not all of them, but a few. There's a woman named Margaret 2 doors down who grows lavender on her windowsill and once brought me banana bread wrapped in a cloth napkin. We talk about simple things. The weather, which birds we've seen, which books we've finished. There's comfort in that, no questions about family, no assumptions. One Saturday, I drove to the coast, alone. I packed a small bag, filled a thermos with coffee, and just went. It was something I'd always put off, waiting for the right companion or the right moment. But that day, I realized I was both. I walked along the shoreline until my calves ached and the sky started turning gold. I didn't cry. I didn't think about who wasn't there. I just breathed. Salt and wind and a kind of stillness I hadn't known I needed. A week later, I bought a new chair for the living room, something soft and wide with a fabric that reminded me of moss. I placed it by the window, angled just so, and that became my place, my corner. I called it my listening chair, though I never explained that name to anyone. I just liked how it felt to sit there and hear the world again, not filtered through expectation or noise. But as it was, I also did something I didn't expect to do. I visited the local community college and asked about taking a course. Nothing intense, just something that might stir something awake in me again. I settled on a memoir writing class. Every Thursday evening, I joined a room of strangers with different pasts, all of us scribbling down the pieces of our lives, trying to make sense of them. That first night, I wrote about the day my son was born. I wrote about the smell of the hospital room, the way Henry's thumb trembled as he buttoned the baby's first onesie, the way my chest had felt full, not just from milk, but from hope. I didn't share it with the group, not yet, but I read it to myself aloud that night, sitting in the listening chair, and I didn't flinch. I also changed my will, quietly, precisely. I set up donations for 2 charities, one that supports women aging alone, and one that helps low-income students attend art school. I left a portion to my niece, someone who, despite living far away, never forgot to call on my birthday, never missed sending a Christmas card with a handwritten note, and the rest. I put it into trust, protected, thought through, not out of revenge, not to make a statement, but because I had learned, painfully, finally, that love without respect is just performance, and I would no longer perform for the people who could not see me. The man who once held my hand across a parking lot and begged me not to let go had become someone who thought of me only when he needed something signed. I no longer held that version of him in my mind. I let him go, gently. Like a paper boat in the water, not out of hate, but out of understanding. He had made his choices, and I had finally started making mine. Every day that passed, I felt the scaffolding of my old life loosen its grip, and something else began to take shape, not louder, not grander, but sturdier, something that stood on its own, me, no longer just a mother or a wife or a helper in the wings, no longer someone defined by the space she took up in someone else's home. I moved differently now, with intention, with softness, with an awareness of what I'd almost lost, and a deep, unwavering knowing of what I would never let be taken again. It wasn't immediate. The way they felt my absence, at first, it was just a gap, a small space in their routines they probably couldn't name, a missed call they didn't notice, a casserole that didn't show up after someone's cold turned into the flu. I imagine the silence crept in slowly, like a low tide that doesn't seem significant until you realize the boat isn't floating anymore, but the absence grew. It always does. The first sign came 3 months after I changed my will and stopped reaching out entirely. I hadn't seen the children since early spring. No birthday cards, no visits. I didn't expect any. I had made peace with that. But then, one afternoon, a knock came at my door. It was my granddaughter. She stood there, holding a binder, a school project clutched tight to her chest. Her voice was soft when she asked, "Do you still have those old photos of Daddy when he was little?" I didn't move right away. I just studied her. She was taller now, wearing sneakers I didn't recognize and earrings that sparkled in the light. It hit me that I didn't know what she'd gotten for Christmas, or how she'd done on her last report card, or what her favorite subject was anymore. I opened the door and stepped aside. She sat at the table and thumbed through the photo box I kept tucked away, the one I thought I might never open again. She lingered on a picture of my son at age 9, holding a fishing rod almost as tall as him. His smile was crooked, his cheeks were sunburned. He'd caught a minnow that day, and we'd pretended it was a shark. He looked so different, she said. Then, quieter, "You weren't at my play." I looked at her and gave a small, honest smile. "No," I said, "I wasn't." She didn't say anything after that, just kept flipping. But she stayed for over an hour. I offered tea, she accepted. We didn't talk much more, but when she left, she hugged me, not out of habit, but because she wanted to. That night, I felt a strange ache, no regret, not longing, just a recognition of how time continues whether or not you're invited to witness it, and how, sometimes, the ones you step away from are the ones who begin to see you more clearly in your distance than they ever did up close. A few weeks later, my phone rang. My son's name lit up the screen. I let it ring. It rang again the next day. Then a message, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond right away. I let the silence do what it had been doing, shaping truth in places where words had failed. Eventually, I answered. His voice was unsure, quieter than I remembered. "Mom," he began, I guess I didn't realize how much you were holding." There was a pause long enough to make me wonder if he'd hung up, but then he added, "Everything feels different without you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence between us had become its own kind of language, one that didn't rush to forgive or explain, but simply allowed truth to float to the surface. Over the following months, there were small attempts, invitations to dinner, texts with updates, photos of the kids. At first, I responded slowly, sometimes not at all. I wasn't being cruel, I was being careful, because once you've been made to feel like a burden, even kindness feels like a test. But I watched. From a distance, I began to see what had unraveled in my absence. They had to cook now, plan birthdays, keep track of appointments. They had to remember where the spare keys were and what time the school closed early and how to keep the dog from chewing the furniture. All the things I once did invisibly now lived in the open, and they were heavier than they expected. I wasn't missed for grand gestures, I was missed in the daily quiet ways. The towels were always folded the same way, on the way I remembered. Who liked strawberry jam and who didn't, in the way I could tell by the sound of someone's cough if it was something to worry about. I had been a kind of gravity in their lives, unseen, but always holding things in place, and when I stepped away, they drifted. One morning, I received a card in the mail, no return address. But the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a single line, "You were never a burden." I held that card to my chest, not because I believed it fully yet, but because it meant someone had said it out loud. I didn't rush back. I didn't resume the old roles. I didn't pick up where we left off. That woman, the one who cooked, quietly, who gave without question, who sat silently in a room full of people who barely looked up, she no longer existed. The woman I had become didn't need to be needed. She needed to be seen, and slowly I began to believe I was. My son called one afternoon, not to ask for anything, but just to say, "I made your old casserole recipe. It didn't taste the same." There was a smile in his voice, a softness. "I think you added something I forgot," he said. I didn't tell him it wasn't an ingredient. It was a presence. It was care. It was years of memory stirred into a pan and baked with hands that remembered too much. What they lost without me wasn't just convenience. It was the quiet scaffolding of a woman who knew every corner of their lives and never once asked to be thanked for it. And what I gained, in that space they didn't know how to fill, was a version of myself I'd long forgotten I could be, one who watched without giving all of herself away, one who gave. If and when she chose, not because she had to, but because she had enough left to give. That shift, that small, steady reclaiming, became the truest thing I had ever owned, and it changed everything. It was late September when I sat down to write the letter. The air had turned crisp. Not cold yet, just enough to make the window pane cool under my fingertips. I had lit a small candle on the kitchen table. The scent was something woodsy, with a trace of clove. I remember because I'd bought it on a whim, a little indulgence that, a year ago, I would have told myself was wasteful. Now, I saw it differently. The letter wasn't planned. It wasn't a response to anything. It wasn't meant to be sent. It was something that had been building inside me, quietly, patiently, ever since I took my name back from their version of me. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was addressed to the space between who I had been and who I was becoming. Still, I began it simply, to the woman I've been all my life, and to the one who waited quietly behind her. I paused after writing that line. My hands rested on the table. There was no sound but the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional chirp outside, the creak of the floorboard settling. I could have stopped there, but the words came, slow and steady, like a memory returning on its own time. I wrote about the dinners I cooked when no one asked, the birthdays I remembered when no one did, the softness I carried into rooms that didn't know how to hold it. I wrote about the hours I spent on benches outside practice fields, folding laundry with care, sewing buttons no one noticed missing. I wrote about the silence, not the angry kind, but the waiting kind, the kind that stretched over years as I stood on the edge of rooms, smiling small, asking nothing. And I wrote about the moment it broke, the hallway, the casserole dish. The words spoken without malice, but with total certainty. "We don't owe you anything." That sentence had carved a space inside me. For a while, it echoed, then it emptied out, and in that space, I had started to rebuild. I told her, the woman, in the letter, that she had not been wrong to love so deeply, that there was no shame in pouring herself out, that the mistake had not been in giving, but in thinking she had to give herself away entirely in order to be worthy of love. I told her she was allowed to want softness in return, to want to be Chosen, not tolerated, to want a chair at the table without having to earn it every time. I wrote about Henry, too. How he used to leave me notes in the kitchen, folded beside the coffee pot, reminding me to buy milk or telling me I looked pretty in blue. How he saw me, even on quiet days. I let myself remember that kind of love, not perfect, but present. I let myself believe I deserved it. I admitted to the fear, too, the fear that without being useful, I would become invisible, that motherhood, in all its devotion, had swallowed parts of me I never learned to keep for myself. And then I forgave myself. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no tears, just a soft breath out, a settling. By the time I reached the end, I had filled for pages. My handwriting had grown looser, softer. At the bottom, I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. I folded the pages and slipped them into an old envelope, not to mail, just to hold. I placed the letter inside the wooden box where I keep small sacred things, a pressed flower from Henry's funeral, a marble from my son's childhood pocket, my mother's brooch. The box doesn't get opened often, but I like knowing it's there, a little archive of the woman I've been. That letter changed me, not because it fixed anything, but because it told the truth. And sometimes the truth is enough to shift the ground you stand on. The next day, I felt lighter, not happier, not certain, just less bound. I went to the park and sat on the bench near the pond, the one where the geese gather in crooked lines and old men play chess without keeping score. I watched the light ripple across the water. I let the breeze lift the edges of my sleeves. A boy passed by with his grandmother. She held his hand tightly, and he was telling her something about frogs and spaceships. I watched them disappear down the path, and I didn't feel envy. Just recognition that I had been her once, that I had given what I could, as long as I could, that it mattered, maybe not in the ways I wanted, maybe not with thank yous or fanfare, but it mattered. Later that week, I received another card, this time from my son. It was brief, awkward, not poetic, but it said, "I'm starting to understand. I hope we can talk soon." I didn't reply right away, not out of punishment, but because I had learned that my time, too, was sacred. I reread the letter I'd written, held the pages in my hands, and whispered something aloud to the quiet kitchen air. You don't owe them your silence. That was the real shift, not the absence of pain, but the presence of self, the knowledge that I could live in my own story again, not just in the margins, but on the page. I placed the letter back in the box, shut the lid gently, and made a cup of tea. Outside, the sky had turned the color of rusted copper, the kind of sky that promises a colder night ahead, but offers a last slant of gold before the dark settles in. I stood there for a long time, not waiting, not mourning, just standing, and knowing, in a way I hadn't before, that I was no longer trying to return to anything. I was becoming someone new, someone who wrote letters, someone who stayed warm on her own, someone who finally saw herself as whole. The house is quiet most days. Not silent. There's the distant hum of the fridge, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the birds that nest outside my kitchen window, but it's the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. There was a time when this quiet made me feel erased, like the stillness was a punishment. Now it feels more like permission, a softness I never knew how to ask for. A room that doesn't need to be filled with noise to feel alive. I woke up early, not out of necessity, just because I like to watch the day begin. I make coffee in my favorite mug, the chipped one with the faded roses, and sit in the chair by the window that faces east. Morning light comes slowly, brushing the tops of the trees before it warms the carpet beneath my feet. Sometimes I sit for half an hour without doing anything, just breathing, just being. There is peace in knowing that no one needs anything from me at that moment. Not a ride, not a casserole, not a last-minute rescue. I am still useful, I suppose, but only in ways I choose now. That's a kind of freedom I never had when I was younger. Too busy proving I was indispensable to notice I was disappearing. Some days I volunteer at the library. Nothing elaborate. I shelve books, chat with the regulars, tidy up the children's corner. There's a little girl who comes in every Thursday with her grandmother, and she always asks me, "Where the sparkle?" Books are, the ones with glitter on the covers and magical creatures inside. I love that she thinks of me as the keeper of the sparkle. In the afternoons, I take walks, the same route, mostly, down the block, past the willow tree, across the park with the duck pond. I know the faces of people I pass now, the man who always jogs in the same red windbreaker, the woman who walks her terrier in a stroller, the boy on the skateboard who nods politely but never says a word. We exist in parallel, and somehow that's enough. I've started keeping a small garden on the balcony. Just herbs, really, basil, mint, a little rosemary. The basil didn't survive the heat wave last month, but the mint is thriving. I use it in tea sometimes or crush it just to smell it on my fingers. In the evenings, I read, not to pass the time, but to enjoy it. I've fallen back in love with stories that meander, with characters who don't need to be fixed, just understood. There's something reassuring in knowing that not every chapter needs a grand resolution. My son calls sometimes, not often, and never for long, but the tone has changed. Less strained, less transactional. Once, he said, "I miss the way you used to fold the towels." I told him he's capable of learning. He laughed, softly. That was enough. There's no sweeping reconciliation, no dramatic apology, just small bridges being built in the quiet. I don't expect more than that. I don't need to. The grandchildren have grown taller. The youngest recently sent me a drawing in the mail, me standing in front of what I think is a flower, though it looks like it might also be a sun. In her shaky handwriting, she wrote, "I love you because you always listen." That one line stayed with me. I pinned it above my desk. Because that's all I ever wanted, really, to be someone whose presence mattered. Not because I did the most, not because I bent myself into whatever was needed, but because I showed up. Because I listened. There's a different kind of richness in my life now, not the kind that comes with noise or money or invitations, but the kind that comes from tending to small joys, like the way warm bread smells when I slice it too soon, or the quiet thrill of finding a bird's nest nestled in the gutter, or the satisfaction of closing a drawer I've finally organized after years of saying I would. I send fewer birthday cards these days, not out of spite, just because I no longer believe that love means reaching endlessly. Sometimes love means sitting still and letting others reach back, if they choose to, and if they don't, well, that's no longer something that hollows me out, it simply passes through. The woman I was a year ago, the one who stood in a hallway holding a casserole dish with hope in her eyes, she is still with me, but she's not driving anymore, she's resting, and I carry her gently. Sometimes I still imagine the house, the one they sold. I picture it at dusk, porch light glowing, someone else's laughter inside, and instead of feeling the loss like a bruise, I feel something softer, gratitude, maybe, that I got to live a life there, that I got to fill those rooms with love, even if that love was forgotten for a time. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It just means no longer carrying the weight of what cannot be changed. I once believed my worth was measured in sacrifice. Now I know it lives in the present, in the quiet, steady heartbeat of a woman who still chooses kindness, even when no one is watching. This life of mine, it isn't loud, it isn't full of people or parties or promises, but it is mine. It is layered and slow and stitched together with memory and meaning. And every day, I wake up with enough air in my lungs and softness in my chest to know that what remains is real. I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. It was an ordinary Thursday when the doorbell rang. I hadn't been expecting anyone. The mail had already come, and I hadn't ordered groceries. I paused, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and walked slowly toward the door, already rehearsing a polite decline in case it was someone selling magazines or asking for donations. But when I opened it, I saw my son standing there, alone, no kids, no distractions, just him, holding nothing, wearing the same navy jacket he'd had for years, the one I once mended at the sleeve without him noticing. His face looked tired, not in a dramatic way, but the kind of tired that lives deep behind the eyes, like something had settled in that he wasn't yet ready to name. I didn't invite him in right away. I just stood there for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around us like a question. I was driving, he said softly, and I ended up here. I stepped aside. He walked in, slow and unsure, like he wasn't sure what he'd find. I hadn't cleaned with company in mind. The blanket on the couch was rumpled, my journal still open on the side table. A mug sat near the window with the last half-inch of tea still cold at the bottom, but he didn't seem to notice any of that, or maybe he did, and for once, it didn't matter. We sat, not across from each other, not yet, but at a soft angle. Like two people waiting for the same bus without knowing where it's headed. For a while, we said nothing. There was no rush, no apology ready on his lips, and I didn't press. I had learned the value of letting silence do its work. Eventually, he said, "I drove past the old house last week." He glanced up at me, as if expecting something, a reaction, a flicker, a door slamming shut, but I just nodded. "There's a reef on the door now," he said, "and a blue bike on the lawn." It felt strange. I folded my hands and waited. I thought it would feel good, he said, selling it, getting everything in order, being practical. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly small in a way I hadn't seen since he was 15 and came home after failing a math test, but it doesn't feel like it was mine to sell. A long breath left my chest, not relief, not satisfaction, just a soft unwinding. I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't reach for his hand. I let the truth sit in the space between us, like a candle neither of us had lit but both of us needed. "I didn't understand what that house was to you," he said. I thought if I took care of the paperwork, I was helping. I didn't see it. That word, see, struck something in me. He hadn't said, "I didn't." Listen, he'd said, "I didn't see," and for a woman who had felt invisible for far too long, those 4 words meant more than he could have known. "I see it now," he added, almost a whisper. "I see you." The tears didn't come all at once. They weren't the kind that spilled over dramatically. They welled quietly, settled behind my eyes like old guests coming home. I looked at him, my son, the man I had once fed from a plastic spoon. The boy whose shoes I tied with stories. The teenager who pulled away too soon, and the adult who didn't look back often enough. And for the first time in years, I saw something in him I hadn't dared hope to see again. Remorse, yes, but more than that, recognition. He saw me. Not just as the background music of his childhood, not as the person who showed up out of habit, but as someone who had lived, loved, been wounded, and rebuilt herself piece by piece when no one else stayed to help. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, "but I know that's not enough." "It doesn't have to be everything," I replied, my voice low, "but it's something." He nodded. "We didn't talk about the will, or the house, or the money. Not that day. Those things, heavy as they once were, had started to lose their weight. What mattered now was simpler, that he had come without being asked, that he had remembered how to find me, that I was no longer waiting on the porch, casserole in hand, hoping to be seen. I had built a life without the need for his apology, and that, in some strange way, had made his apology real. We sat for a while longer. I offered him tea, and He accepted. I served it in the mismatched mugs I'd bought after I stopped setting the table for guests who rarely came. He said the tea was good. I smiled. It wasn't, but that wasn't the point. When he left, he hugged me, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but with both arms. Held long enough to say something his words never had. I didn't cry until the door closed behind him, and even then, it wasn't grief. It was something else, something softer, a kind of exhale I hadn't felt in years. That night, I went to bed early. The moonlight slipped across my wall like it used to in the old house. I thought about how much I had lost, and how much I had reclaimed without even knowing it. The woman I had become didn't wait for love to find her. She learned how to live without it, and that, perhaps, was what made her worthy of it again. I lay there, hands folded over my stomach. The window cracked open, the night cool and quiet. Around me, he had seen me, and I had stayed whole long enough for that moment to arrive, not out of hope, but out of grace, because sometimes when you stop waiting for the knock, that's when it finally comes, and you open the door not as the person they left behind, but as the woman you chose to become.